In a quiet valley in the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, there is an old cemetery. In a quiet valley in the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, there is an old cemetery. And carved into the stones are dates, and among those dates, a terrible cluster. In the years 1338 and 1339, an unusual number of people in this small trading community died, and some of the inscriptions carved into their tombstones record the cause with a single chilling word: pestilence. For centuries, no one understood the significance of these graves. But in 2022, scientists extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of the people buried here, and what they found rewrote the origin of the deadliest pandemic in human history, because most of what you were taught about the Black Death is wrong. The textbooks have repeated for more than 250 years that the Black Death began in China. That is the story. And a landmark study published in the journal Nature in 2022 pointed somewhere else entirely. Not China, but this Silk Road trading community high in the mountains of Central Asia. This is the true origin of the Black Death. This is the true origin of the Black Death and the new science that uncovered it. To understand what these scientists found, you have to understand what the Black Death actually was. It was a catastrophe almost beyond comprehension. In the middle of the 14th century, a disease swept across Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, and in the span of just a few years, it killed a staggering portion of the human population. In Europe alone, an estimated 30 to 60% of all people died. Think about that. In some places, more than half of everyone you knew gone within a few years, whole villages emptied, cities piled with the dead. It was the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded history. And for centuries, the story of where it came from was murky, blurred by distance and time, generally pointing vaguely toward China or the East. But science has now sharpened that blurry picture into something precise. The disease was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, the plague. And by studying the genetic history of this bacterium, and by extracting its DNA from the teeth of long-dead victims, scientists can now trace its family tree and locate where a particular deadly strain first exploded. When researchers analyzed the DNA from those graves in Kyrgyzstan, dated to 1338 and 1339, just a few years before the Black Death erupted across Europe, they found something remarkable. They found Yersinia pestis. And not just any strain. They found what appears to be the ancestor, the source strain, sitting right at the base of the massive family tree of plague lineages that the Black Death and its descendants belong to. In genetic terms, this was extraordinarily close to the origin point. This little trading community, nestled in the Tian Shan Mountains, was one of the earliest known epicenters of the pandemic, years before it reached the West. So how did the plague get into that community in the first place? The answer lies in the mountains themselves, and in the animals that live there. The Tian Shan region is home to wild rodents, including marmots, that naturally carry plague in what scientists call a reservoir. The bacterium lives among these wild rodent populations, circulating quietly for long periods, and every so often it spills over, jumping from the wild rodents to humans, often through the bites of infected fleas. This community sat in exactly such a region, and it sat on the Silk Road, the great network of trade routes that connected east and west. And that combination, a natural plague reservoir plus a bustling trade route, was the spark and the fuse lying right next to each other. Because once the plague jumped into this trading community, it had a highway ready to carry it across the world, the Silk Road. In the 14th century, these trade routes were more active than ever, in part because of the Mongol Empire, which for a time had unified a huge stretch of Asia and made long-distance trade across the continent possible on an unprecedented scale. Caravans, merchants, animals, and goods moved along these routes, connecting the mountains of Central Asia to the markets of the Middle East and the ports of the Black Sea. And the plague moved with them. It traveled the trade routes, community by community, caravan by caravan, spreading westward across Asia toward Europe, following the very networks that had made the medieval world so connected and so prosperous. The thing that had knit the world together became the thing that carried its destruction. And this brings us to a second stunning piece of new science, one that reframes how the plague finally broke into Europe. For a long time, the picture was simply that plague spread along the trade routes and eventually reached the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. But research published in 2025 from scientists connected to Cambridge and the Leibniz Institute added a startling new factor: climate. These researchers found evidence of a previously unknown volcanic eruption around the year 1345, and a large volcanic eruption can disrupt the climate, dimming sunlight and cooling temperatures, which damages harvests. The evidence suggests this eruption helped trigger crop failures across parts of the Mediterranean world in the years right before the Black Death struck Europe, and here is why that matters so much. When your local harvests fail, you have to get food from somewhere else. So Italian merchants, facing grain shortages at home, increasingly imported grain from the fertile regions around the Black Sea. Ships sailed to the Black Sea ports, loaded up with grain, and carried it back to feed the hungry cities of Italy. But grain shipments do not travel alone. Grain attracts rodents, and rodents carry fleas, and those fleas, in this case, carried plague. So the very trade in food, driven by a climate disaster caused by a distant volcano, helped carry plague-infected pests directly from the Black Sea region into the heart of the Mediterranean. In this telling, climate and trade and disease became links in a single deadly chain. The volcano dims the sky, the harvests fail, the grain ships sail, and the plague rides along with the cargo. And at the far end of that chain sits one of the most infamous and dramatic episodes in the entire story: the siege of Caffa. Caffa was a trading port on the Black Sea, controlled by merchants from the Italian city of Genoa. In the mid-1340s, it came under siege by Mongol forces, and according to a later account by a man named Gabriel de Mussy, something horrifying happened during that siege. As the plague broke out among the Mongol besiegers, they allegedly used catapults to hurl the bodies of their own plague dead over the walls and into the city, deliberately trying to infect the defenders. If true, it would be one of the earliest recorded attempts at biological warfare, the weaponizing of a terrible disease. Now, historians treat this story with real caution. The account was written later, and possibly not by an eyewitness, and scholars debate how accurate it is, and whether catapulting corpses would even have been the main way the disease got into the city, since infected fleas and rodents were likely moving through the area regardless. So we should be careful. The dramatic image of flying plague corpses may be exaggerated or embellished, but whether through catapulted bodies or simply through the rats and fleas swarming a besieged port, the outcome was the same. The plague got into Caffa, and it got onto the ships. When the besieged Genoese merchants fled Caffa and sailed home, they carried the plague with them into the Mediterranean. And in 1347, their ships arrived at ports like Messina in Sicily, and then Marseille and Genoa itself. Contemporary accounts describe ships arriving with sailors already dead or dying, covered in strange black swellings. The people of Messina, realizing these ships carried something monstrous, tried to drive them away. But it was already too late. The plague was ashore, and from those ports it exploded across Europe with terrifying speed, following the trade routes and roads inland, striking city after city, village after village. Within just a few years, it had swept across nearly the entire continent. And here we come to yet another way the new science overturns the old story. Because most of us were taught a very specific mechanism for how the Black Death spread. Rats. The standard story says that black rats infected with plague carried the disease, and that fleas jumping from those rats to humans spread it from person to person. Rats on ships, rats in cities, rats everywhere, driving the pandemic. But this rat-based model has a serious problem. The Black Death spread incredibly fast, and it spread in patterns that do not match how a rat-borne epidemic should behave. Rat-driven plague tends to move in a particular, often slower way, dependent on rat populations dying off first. The Black Death often moved faster and differently than that. So researchers, including a team connected to the University of Oslo, built mathematical models to test the competing explanations. They compared how the disease actually spread against what different transmission methods would predict. And their modeling suggested that the rat model did not fit the historical patterns nearly as well as another explanation. Human parasites, specifically human fleas and body lice. The parasites that lived on people themselves and on their clothing could pass the plague directly from human to human, without needing armies of dying rats as the middleman. In crowded, unwashed medieval conditions where people lived close together and body lice and fleas were common, this human-to-human route through parasites could explain the ferocious speed of the spread far better. Now, this remains an area of active scientific debate. Not every researcher fully agrees, and the exact mix of transmission routes is still being studied. But the growing evidence suggests that the simple picture of rats as the main villains is, at the very least, incomplete, and that human parasites likely played a major, underappreciated role in driving the catastrophe. And when the dying finally slowed, the world that remained had been utterly transformed in ways that reshaped the entire structure of civilization. Because when 30 to 60% of the population dies in a few years, everything changes. And one of the most profound changes was economic. Before the plague, much of Europe ran on a feudal system, with a large population of peasants and serfs bound to the land, working for lords, with little bargaining power. Labor was abundant, and so labor was cheap, and ordinary working people had little leverage. Then the plague killed a huge share of the workforce, and suddenly labor was scarce. There were far fewer workers to till the fields, harvest the crops, and do the work of society. And scarcity, as always, means power. For the first time, ordinary laborers and peasants found that their work was in high demand. They could ask for higher wages. They could demand better conditions. They could leave a harsh lord and find work elsewhere, because someone, somewhere, was desperate for hands. The rigid feudal order, which depended on cheap, plentiful, bound labor, was thrown into crisis. Lords tried to fight back, passing laws to freeze wages and keep peasants in their place. But the underlying economic reality had shifted permanently. The survivors of the plague were simply worth more, in economic terms, than they had been before. And over the following generations, this contributed to the slow unraveling of serfdom across much of Europe, and to the rise of a freer, more mobile, wage-based labor force. The catastrophe of death became, for the survivors, a strange and painful engine of economic change. So look at the full, true chain of the Black Death, as the newest science reveals it. It began not in China, but in a trading community in the Tianshan Mountains of Central Asia, where plague spilled from wild rodents into humans living along the Silk Road. It spread westward along the trade routes of the Mongol world, carried by caravans and merchants. A volcanic eruption around 1345 disrupted the climate and the harvests, pushing Mediterranean merchants to import grain from the Black Sea. And that grain trade helped carry the plague toward Europe. At the siege of Caffa, the disease broke into the world of Italian shipping, whether by catapulted corpses or simply by the pests of a besieged port. Genoese ships carried it to Messina, Marseille, and Genoa in 1347. And once ashore, it spread with horrifying speed, driven not merely by rats, but very likely by the fleas and lice living on human bodies themselves. And in its wake, it shattered the old feudal order and helped reshape the economic structure of an entire continent. It is a story where climate, trade, disease, and economics are not separate threads, but a single, interlocking chain, each link making the next possible. And it is a reminder that the connections that bind our world together, the trade routes, the shipping lanes, the flow of food across borders, are the same connections that can carry catastrophe from one end of the earth to the other. The medieval world learned that lesson at a cost almost too vast to imagine, which leaves a question genuinely worth sitting with, and I want to know where you land on it. The old story, that the Black Death simply started in China and spread by rats on ships, survived in the textbooks for over 250 years. Do you think it lasted so long? Because people truly believed it was accurate? Or because it was simply a convenient, tidy story that no one thought to question until the science finally caught up? Tell me in the comments what you think, because the way this history was told and retold says almost as much as the history itself. And if this pulled apart a story you thought you understood, if you want more history, where the real cause is hidden beneath the one everyone repeats, then subscribe and stay with us. Because the next story we are opening up is another moment where the world was told one thing, while the truth sat buried in the ledgers the entire time. You will not want to miss it.